Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. My name's Andrew Mueller. I'm the host of the Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. I will be your compere for this event, and I'm delighted to be joined on stage by Nusrat Ghani, MP, the United Kingdom's Minister of State for Europe. We're going to start with a few remarks from the Minister, and then we will pick it up from there with matters arising.
Thank you so much, and good afternoon, everybody. I thought I'd say a few words at the top just to set the scene before we have a discussion. Now, we all know that over 2 years ago, when the first tanks thundered towards Kyiv, Putin would have felt invincible. But events have since shown how foolish he was. Foolish enough to underestimate Ukraine's bravery. Foolish enough to think his military incompetence would go unnoticed. And foolish enough to doubt the West's resolve to stand so firmly behind Ukraine. The twisted lies that Putin spreads to justify the invasion and mask his failures cannot hide a simple truth. He believes that he can take territories and redraw borders when he wants and where he wants. And he believes he can get away with it at every single time. Well, not this time. Ukraine must win. Why? Because our collective security is at stake. A defeat will invite more aggression. A victory will deter it. The question is not whether we have the ability to achieve this. Ukraine has shown it can defend itself. The question is whether we will see this through. By defending Ukraine, we defend the values, the UN Charter we all subscribe to, the values which have allowed us all to prosper. Respect for sovereignty, and it's just not about maintaining lines on a map, it is about having the freedom to choose how we want to live. All countries have that right, and Ukraine is fighting to uphold that right for all of us. The UK was privileged to play its part in welcoming Ukrainians forced from their homes, but they have a right to return, and we collectively have an obligation to enable them to do so. Putin wants them out because he wants to destroy, displace and devalue Ukrainian identity and the Ukrainian culture. We cannot hand him what he craves. We must also honour the legacy of Navalny and his unwavering commitment to Russian democracy. I applaud Yulia's courage and resilience. Her foundation will continue Navalny's fight, and that remains the best tribute to his enduring vision. So how can we restore freedom, prosperity and democracy in Ukraine? I would like to highlight the three ways in which the UK is helping to rebuild its economy. First, by committing financially. Over the last 2 years, we have provided almost $5 billion of non-military support. That involves $16 billion in total. We are boosting its fiscal firepower, and last month we worked with the World Bank to speed up and increase the size of loans. As a result, the UK and Japan are providing $1.5 billion to help with immediate pressures. We and our G7 partners have also been clear. Russia must pay for the damage it has caused. We will pursue all routes through which Russian assets can be used to support Ukraine. Second, by harnessing the power of the private sector, the World Bank judges recovery will require almost $500 billion. Daunting as that sounds, it is achievable if we tap into the capital, creativity and expertise of businesses. The Ukraine Recovery Conference in London last year mobilised international partners, including the private sector, raising a staggering $60 billion of support. We, of course, have much further to go, but it was a clear indication of what we can achieve together. Last year, I also personally oversaw the creation of a war risk insurance scheme to protect and encourage UK businesses to support Ukraine. Finally, we are helping by stimulating Ukraine's trading industry. Before the invasion, it was a leading exporter of food, grain, steel, and so much more. There is no reason why that should not be the case once again. So the UK is undertaking a series of trade missions to strengthen long-term cooperation and galvanise investment into Ukraine. Make no mistake, this is the defining struggle of our generation. The make or break moment is this year. The cost of failing to support Ukraine now will be far greater than the cost of repelling Putin. That is why we must devote our hard-worked resources and precious time to this collective endeavour. And I'll just finish on what President Zelensky put so well. When asked what will bring the end of the war, we used to say peace. this is President Zelensky, now we say victory. There is so much to do and so little time. Thank you for giving me a few minutes at the top. Thank you.
Well, Minister, that is a resonant declaration of support, and I'm sure it would meet with broad agreement from most people gathered at this forum. But you will have heard this more than once, I'm sure, from the Ukrainians I know you've spoken to over the last couple of years, that it's still not enough. And Ukrainians I know do fear that a division is growing between countries further east, which recognise, for obvious reasons, the urgency of the situation, and those countries further west, which do perhaps feel like the situation in Ukraine is contained and is managed, and also at some level fear the consequences of a Russian defeat. Do you think that Western European countries in particular have been clear enough on what they actually want to happen here?
I think it was put beautifully by the minister, the Ukrainian minister earlier on today, which is there's been a lot of discussion and there are lots of processes in play, but the issue that we have is pace. When the Ukrainians say we need more ammunition, we need to reflect on procurement, we need to reflect on manufacturing and getting the goods that they actually need, whether it's ammunition or whether it is drones. The next is financial support. We need to make sure that financial support is reaching into Ukraine, and that also means that the work at the URC that we did last year, what will happen no doubt this year, is making sure that they have the capabilities of absorbing that financial support too, because not only do we need to make sure that Ukraine can defend itself militarily, but also it can make sure its economy is resilient to Russia. The reason why we are, if I may say, so selfishly involved in Ukraine is I have a substantial amount of Ukrainians in my constituency. There is no deviation from my voters, whether they're Ukrainian or British, that we should be supporting Ukraine. Because we're dealing with something that most politicians wake up and do every day, which is defending and promoting liberal democracies. And we are trying to ensure that someone like Putin and his totalitarian imperialism does not spread. This is an individual who has no care for borders, no care for international law, or no care for sovereignty. So whether you're geographically close or geographically far, this will impact our future. And as I said in my speech, this is a generational struggle. And the only way to get through this is by making sure that Ukraine can win.
But are we being clear enough, and by we I mean Europe as a continent, about what we mean when we say Ukraine wins? Do we mean the situation is broadly managed back to where we were in 2014, or are we talking about victory as in Russia evicted from every scrap of Ukrainian territory that it currently holds?
I think the Ukrainians have been clear what they decide what a win is. But the reality is they need to have sovereign over their country. They need to have freedom. They need to be able to undertake, democracy the way we enjoy democracy in our countries. We need to make sure, of course, that we support Ukraine in having the right institutions to develop its public sector and also give confidence to the private sector to come in and invest. I don't think they can do that if Putin has any authority over Ukraine. So we have to remove Putin from Ukraine's territory. We need to make sure that we're supporting Ukraine in returning to the freedom, the democracy that it once was.
Do you think there's an argument, though, that Western European countries, again, could be yet more explicitly and symbolically severe in how they address Russia? And I know, and we will get on to this, you in particular require no instruction as to what can happen when you cross Russia. You are one of that possibly unique coterie of people who are double sanctioned by both Russia and China. And I do want to get on to that. But is there an argument, do you think, at this point for taking dramatic steps like severing diplomatic relations with Russia? I mean, I for example, don't really understand why the United Kingdom didn't do that after the Salisbury poisonings.
Well, you're trying to get me to stray into areas that...
That's exactly what I'm trying to do, yes.
But I think that the topic in hand is far more serious than trying to get a sort of snapshot for media coverage, to be honest. We do need to have, this is the make or break here, I believe. There are so many elections taking place, so many other issues that can take up our time. And if we stray away from the commitments that we have made or the commitments that we need to make, it will give further confidence to Putin. So I would urge everybody in this room, when they go back home to their countries or the countries that they represent, is to ensure that the commitment that we have in place is just escalated and we do not deviate from the support that we give to Ukraine. Regardless of what's happening to us domestically, we'll all be distracted by elections, no doubt, but we cannot give Putin any sort of scintilla of hope that we aren't going to be focused as we have been and that we need to be. I think it was mentioned earlier on today, we just need to provide more support They require more support when it comes to defence, and obviously they need more commitment when it comes to economically.
You don't think making Russia's pariah status even more explicit than it already is would help?
I'm just going to reflect on the work I was doing as a sanctions minister. This is where it really matters. How do you hit Putin really hard? This is about making sure that you apply the sanctions policy as we have done in the UK. This is also about seizing assets, and it's also about limiting trade relationships. And that's been a massive hit to his economy. It's cost hundreds of billions of pounds, and I was reading a figure that actually collectively the work that's been done on limiting trade or preventing trade or on sanctions means that overall that cost would equate to 4 more years of him having financial support to continue his aggression in Ukraine. Let's hit Putin where it's hurt. Let's not talk about and speculate what might be more attractive politically, but what matters now to Ukraine is practical support, either financial support, diplomatic support, defence support, and also hitting the Russian economy where it really matters.
I mean, are you, though, disappointed / surprised by how relatively resilient the Russian economy has seemed over the last couple of years, compared to certainly what was predicted when the first sanctions were imposed? There were lots of lurid and obviously optimistic and hopeful speculation that this would absolutely kick the legs from under the Russian economy, but they have adapted.
They have, but also, Putin is probably managing the Russian economy and the loss of life in Russia that we would never be able to sustain because we run our countries and we run, when you're democratic, you have many more people to answer to. But the economy is it is under the cost, as I said earlier. All the decisions that we have taken collectively have cost his economy £400 billion. It will be taking a hit. But this is Putin. He will continue. He will continue, which is why it's so important that we support Ukraine. And he will also continue hoping at some point somebody will pull away and maybe think we're not going to provide any more support because we have domestic or international issues. Or, he has ways of being able to coerce because of the links that he has in providing energy and other elements of very important energy infrastructure and the resources that are critical to those economies further away from Russia, which is why it's so important that we meet at these events and collectively engage and encourage each other to continue the work that we're doing.
So I do have to ask, what actually does happen when you are, as an individual, sanctioned by Russia? Do they tell you? Do they send you a little badge? I mean, how does it actually work?
Well, quite a while ago, I was working with a number of colleagues domestically and internationally to collect evidence of war crimes, because we wanted to make sure that we collected the evidence to a way that could be interrogated at a court and he could be held account for the war crimes that he was committing within Ukraine. Because of that work, I was sanctioned by Putin. You end up being on a list, and it's not a list I particularly want to be on because of the way that he conducts business, not only in his own territory, but of course overseas as well. Somewhere it is a badge of honour. For me, it makes me more determined to work with the Ukrainians and ensure that I can do everything I can in my power whilst I am a minister or even a member of parliament to give them the support that they need. What the sanctions has also done for a number of us around the world is ensured that we communicate amongst ourselves. So whenever the Ukrainians are working with us, we try and move their positions internally in our own country, in our own governments, but also work collectively with our colleagues who may be struggling a lot more to convince their voters that it matters to use hard-won resources to help Ukraine in its endeavour. I'm not sure it's a badge of honour, but it's a very small price to pay for very important work.
I mean, if there is one thing on which Ukraine's European allies have agreed in theory, at least, if not always in practice, it is that European unity is extremely important in supporting Ukraine. You are now Minister of State for Europe. You were also a campaigner in favour of Brexit. If anyone wants to do a spot of light booing, now would be the moment. But does the fact of war on Europe's doorstep maybe prompt some rethinking of how the UK should interact with Europe? Should it work more closely than it has? Should it be a little less dogmatic about wanting to be a part than it has been these last 6 or 7 years?
Well, we just have a new relationship with Europe. We still work with Europe, and Brexit was a long, long time ago.
Seems even longer.
It seems a long, long time ago. But I think what's been important is that we've been able to make decisions quite quickly. In the UK, we didn't have to wait for collective decision-making, as it were, which gave us the responsibility, I suppose, which is why we've been so forthright in supporting Ukraine. We are now being as vocal as we can with our European counterparts, trying to provide as much encouragement, as much support, trying to make sure that we are making decisions collectively to support Ukraine too. When we talk about URC, The last conference was in London, the next one will be Germany. It's making sure that we can hand over to Germany a fantastic piece of work that we've done over the last year, and they can then take it forward. It's just a different way of working. But the reality is we can determine what we want to do a lot faster and be focused on the issues that we think are important. And for us, we have determined that supporting Ukraine is one of the key issues that we want to be focusing our attention and our energies on.
But sitting outside the European Union, as the United Kingdom now does, do you see, I guess, the balance of power within the EU shifting? And this is something that has been talked about a lot. We have seen the Eastern European countries, the Baltic states, being much more assertive and much more forthcoming about insisting on being listened to, and indeed insisting that they should have been listened to all along, because it turns out we were right after all. But obviously Poland is remilitarising hugely. There will presumably and hopefully come a point at which Ukraine is a member of the EU and of NATO. Does the United Kingdom, do you think, look to that part of Europe as perhaps the future of Europe, this new power bloc in the EU that is growing in the East?
I think Brexit showed that we're always looking beyond the borders of the traditional, the EU borders. And we always knew that we always wanted to work with countries beyond those borders and obviously work beyond Europe as well. So we've always been vocal and active and wanted to participate, and will continue to do so. I'm not going to start sort of talking about issues that are very EU related. I think that'll be for other people within the EU to comment on. But the reality is this: what happens in Ukraine not only impacts the countries bordering Ukraine, it was said very passionately by the minister earlier on, but it impacts us all. This could fundamentally destabilise Europe, and also puts into play the question of the European project, which is why it's so important that countries, whether they are closer to Ukraine or those closer to us in Europe, focus their time and energy and realise and make it clear to their local voters, so it's not a difficult international policy to have, that supporting Ukraine is going to cost, but actually the cost of Putin winning is going to be far worse.
I mean, do you have in your mind a likely timescale for victory in Ukraine? Do you think this is something that we have to resign ourselves to the fact is, or the idea is likely to be a years-long struggle? 2 years ago at this point, there was still an amount of optimism attached to the fact that Russia's early offensive had failed, that Ukraine was ready and indeed abundantly willing to fight. But do you think we have to kind of, absent a sudden precipitate collapse in the Russian lines, which I guess is not impossible, or another attempt by one of Vladimir Putin's former caterers to overthrow him, do you think we have to resign ourselves to the fact that this will be with us for a while, this conflict?
But it's best for the Ukrainians to respond to that. Having worked with the Ukrainians now for well over a year, I was working with the Deputy Prime Minister on the Ukrainian Reconstruction Task Force. I've always, in my own mind, felt that this could take a little while longer than we had once anticipated. But I was just looking at the data, and this is costing Russia quite a bit. To date, over 355,000 Russian personnel have been killed. The average day number of Russian casualties in Ukraine throughout February 24 was 983 per day. Russia has depleted its missile stockpiles in desperate airstrikes. The defence now takes up 40% of Russian government spending and 6% of its GDP. It's costing Russia a lot in people and its economy too. I am resolved to the fact that if it does take time, it is so important that we engage in Ukraine reconstruction now to make sure that we are standing up their economy, fundamentally to allow those Ukrainians to return back home. And also when it's over, there isn't a stop, that the economy can just move forward as quickly as it should.
I do want to close by asking a question about British politics, which I do think is linkable to the politics nearer to where we're sitting. The United Kingdom is one of those countries which will probably have an election this year, although you can hold on till January if you're really...
24th, I think, maybe something like that.
Yeah, you can hold on till then if you think your luck might change. I mean, you will have seen the national polls, which I will not depress you by reminding you of. But the likelihood is your seat is very safe. Do you think much about the future of conservatism in the United Kingdom and how it might pan out? And I guess the two measures I'm thinking of are one in the country in which we are sitting, in which a pragmatic, not terribly ideological centre-right government has accomplished considerable amounts in the last few years, versus the United States, where what was once broadly thought of as a sensible, pragmatic centre-right Conservative Party has gone full Yahoo to the extent that it is gambling with the defence of Europe for party political reasons.
Gosh, that's a very big question. So first of all, I think it's quite...
You've got 90 seconds.
I've got
How
90
hard
seconds.
can it be?
First of all, just because it's very different to different countries. I am
True.
a government minister, but I'm also a parliamentarian, and I have a constituency to take care of. And like many countries, how many are there? Is it 50, 60? I cannot remember.
A lot
A
this
lot
year.
of countries are having elections this year, which is why it's so important that we stay steadfast in helping Ukraine. And like many countries, we are dealing with the cost of COVID, and obviously there's obviously a cost to our economy, because Ukraine was so important to our economy. So there are some difficult decisions taken by politicians, and like many politicians in democratic countries, you take difficult decisions and then you have to go out and ask for the confidence of the voters once again. The only poll I'm interested in is the one that will take place at the general election, and we'll obviously fight that campaign incredibly hard. But there is a bigger question about what sort of ideologies will prevail after these, so many elections are taking place next year. I think what's important to what we are trying to do and have this discussion about today in the elections that are taking place is that we constantly support passionately the values of liberal democracies. We constantly support the value of having open economies, making sure that countries can trade freely, and that you need a lot of freedom, a lot of security, and be also to have sovereignty to do that. And those are the values I think we will be sharing at the next election. And thank you so much for pointing out my safest seat. Nothing is safe because we're going out to the voters. And like every election, every vote is out there for fight for, but regardless, we in the UK have never had any dispute with any opposition parties in our commitment to Ukraine. And that's quite unique, and this is why it's so important that I'm here.
Nusrat Ghani, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you all very much.